Hello, and welcome to the Radiant Mission Podcast. My name is Rebecca Twomey, and I'm here with my amazing co-host and sister, Rachel Smith.
Hey, guys.
We are on a mission to encourage and inspire others as they navigate through this life and with their relationship with Christ. And today we have a very fun episode. We're talking about the biblical feasts, specifically Passover. And that's it, because that's all we're going to have time for, because all the rest of the feasts are going to be separate episodes. So if you're here to learn about Passover. And if you're like me, you probably learned about Passover 2 episodes ago from Rachel. And maybe today is your first time really truly learning about Passover from a feast perspective, and potentially from maybe I'm going to celebrate Passover or whatever you call it. Is that what you call it? Celebrate?
Yeah, sure. You can say celebrate.
Observe?
Yeah.
Observe.
You can keep it.
Keep the Passover.
Yeah.
So we're excited. Rachel is very prepared today.
Yes.
She has lots of notes and lots of information to share with you guys. And I know that she's very passionate about this. So
yeah, I've really done my homework on this one, and I really wanted to make sure. I have like 1,000 thoughts in my mind about Passover, and I really wanted to make sure that all 1,000 of them come out.
All 1,000. Yeah.
And there's a lot of scripture that I want to go over with this one too. So
good.
Buckle up.
So start us from the beginning of the biblical feasts. How many are there? And when do they fall in terms of timing? And then obviously this is a spring one. So probably this is, the first one that you're going to talk about. So
yeah. So there are 7 biblical feasts described in the Bible in what's known as the Torah. The Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible. 4 of the feasts are in the spring, and 3 of them are in the fall. And I'm going to go over them all in as much detail as I can in each episode. Some of them, there's a lot more detail in scripture than other, Passover being one of them. There's a lot of detail about Passover, both in the Old and the New Testament. So today I'm going to start with the first of the spring feast, which is Passover. And that's very timely because the feasts begin on our current calendar for this year next month. And I was going to try to cover all 4 of the spring feasts in this episode, but then I realized how much all the 1,000 ideas swirling around my head about.
I think I also said, do you really think you could talk about that in an hour or less? And you're like,
yeah. No. And I was like, yeah, we'll be lucky if I get through Passover in less than an hour. So so we're just gonna talk about actually the first 2 feasts, because they are intertwined together in a lot of ways, Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So we'll cover those today, but the bulk of it is really going to be about Passover.
Cool.
So what I'm really passionate about is how we can find Yeshua in each and every one of the feasts, and how he has, or he will, fulfill them all. And this is especially significant as his followers and his disciples, because at his first coming, he fulfilled all 4 of the spring feasts. Exactly. Like back to back to back to back, the day that they all happened.
And explain what that means, that he fulfilled them.
So I'll kind of open up what that means more as I get into each one.
Okay.
Like all the details I'm about to get into with Passover, there's a ton of details that he fulfills. And I'm going to go over to an extent the last Passover and what he's fulfilling in the real time that we're reading.
Okay.
So that will that question will kind of be answered along the way more than I could just sum up in a sentence right now.
Well, the feasts are the Passover is fulfilling certain prophecy that happened earlier. Correct?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. I think actually a better way of thinking about it is everything that God, Yahweh, has written in the Bible, in the Torah, we get a picture of the meaning of it all. And he does things so precisely that in his son, the Messiah, the deeper meaning comes out.
Okay.
And so it doesn't always seem like it is a prophecy when it was written, but then we see after Messiah's death, burial, and resurrection and ascension into the right hand of the Father, that so the whole picture is just beautifully painted for us.
Okay.
So Yahweh, every single thing that he has said is so precise and so perfect. Just the fact that there are 7 feasts, because 7 is often represented in the Bible as the number of completeness. So that is a very meaningful number in and of itself.
Okay.
So with that said, the fall feasts, those 3 have yet to be fulfilled. But many, including myself, believe that those will be fulfilled at his second coming. And I will explain that in much more detail when we go over those in a few weeks.
Okay.
Because that's just a lot more information. So stick around to hear what I have to say about all that.
Yeah.
So first off, I want to start out by clearing something up because I hear it often. And that is, aren't these Jewish holidays?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what people say.
Question myself because I hear it. Yeah. And the short answer is no. These are Yahweh's feasts that he appointed to the nation of Israel as a way to commune with and honor him.
Mm-hmm.
And each has a different meaning and significance, but he lays it all out for us very clearly in the books of Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So pretty much the Torah. And he lays it all out that these are feasts that belong to him.
Okay.
I think that is really important to acknowledge because this is all from his word. And yes, there have been traditions formed around the feasts that are specifically Jewish traditions that aren't necessarily biblical. But the fact of the matter is, Yeshua, all of his disciples, and many of the apostles, including Paul, celebrated these feasts. And there's many places in the New Testament where Paul references the feasts. And I believe understanding each of their significance brings deeper understanding of his words and what the feast can mean for us. So let's get into Passover.
I have a quick question for you before we get into Passover.
Yeah.
And that is with the word feasts. Feasts.
Yeah.
Feasts. Either or.
Yeah.
What does that mean from a biblical perspective?
So that's a good question, because for a lot of them, part of the command is to have a feast. All of the
have
feasts,
like a big dinner.
yes,
basically.
all of the feasts are meant to be kept or celebrated, whatever you want to say, in communion with others. They're not meant to be done alone.
Mm-hmm.
What you will read in the Torah is they all, or yeah, I'm pretty sure all of them also included sacrifices at the temple by the high priest. And so that's an element that cannot be kept by anyone. You know, there's reasons, and I'll get into that, why Christians wouldn't. But also, even if Jews wanted to keep these feasts the way that it's actually commanded in the Torah, they couldn't because they don't have a temple.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's an element of it. But as I'm even thinking about it, like the Feast of Atonement, that one is it's said solemn assembly. So it's not necessarily a good old time party. Actually, most people fast from eating.
Yeah. Kind of the opposite a little bit.
Yeah. So I think in my mind, to give my own opinion here, it's using that word instead of holiday. The word holiday actually means holy day. I kind of correlate that word though to more of the word, like the other nations or the world's holy days.
The modern day holidays.
Right. I don't think it would necessarily be inappropriate to say Passover is a holiday. I mean, that you can say that. But it is definitely a feast. So that's why I use that term. So
just curious about that one.
Yeah. So starting out with Passover, we're going to start out, like I said, not only because it's the first of the biblical feasts of the year, but it's incredibly important to not just the Jewish faith, but also the Christian faith. And many may not realize that Yeshua was crucified on Passover. And the Last Supper that he had with his disciples was actually a Passover Seder. The elements of the bread and the wine that he passed around are traditional components of every Passover Seder. So when he said, excuse me, guys, I'm really pregnant right now, so I get out of breath.
You could talk a little slower. It's okay.
Yeah. So at his last Passover Seder, when he said, "Do this in remembrance of me," he was literally talking about doing Passover in remembrance of him. This was later made into the Catholic sacrament of communion, but the original breaking of the bread and passing of the wine was part of Passover. And I'll get into more of how beautiful the significance of that moment was with the original Passover in a few moments. But first,
what does Seder mean?
Seder means order. It means a ceremonial dinner for the first night of Passover.
Okay.
So let's talk about the original Passover and why did Yahweh want it observed? So to answer that question, I'm going to read straight from the book of Exodus for a few minutes. I think that's the best place to always go for these things, is back to what the word says. So bear with me for a minute. I'm going to read it and then I'm going to kind of expound on some things that we see there. So I'm going to read from Exodus chapter 12, and I'm going to take a deep breath. I'm going to get out of breath. Now the Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month shall be the beginning of months for you. It is to be the first month of the year to you. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, on the 10th of this month, they are each one to take a lamb for themselves, according to their father's household, a lamb for each household. Now, if the household is too small for a lamb, then he and his neighbor nearest to his house are to take one according to the number of persons in them. According to what each man should eat, you are to divide the lamb. Your lamb shall be an unblemished male, a year old. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. You shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel is to kill it at twilight. Moreover, they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and on the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. They shall eat the flesh that same night, roasted with fire, and they shall eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled at all with water, but rather roasted with fire, which its head and its legs along with its entrails. And you shall not leave any of it over until morning. But whatever is left of it until morning, you shall burn with fire. Now you shall eat it in this manner, with your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover, for I will go through the land of Egypt on that night, and will strike down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am Yahweh. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you live. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you. And no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. So as you can see, Yahweh gives us a lot of detail there.
Yeah, that's pretty specific.
Yes.
Like, take a lamb, only roast it.
Has to be perfect, unblemished.
Don't do any of these other things. Must be a male, 1-year-old. Keep your shoes on.
Got to keep your shoes on. Yeah, exactly.
Keep your shoes on while you're eating, please.
Yeah. And it's not in this passage. I believe it might be in a passage from Deuteronomy, but he also specifies not a bone should be broken on the lamb. So the background to this command for this first feast from Yahweh, we might all be familiar with, especially if you've ever seen the classic 90s animated movie, The Prince of Egypt, which I just watched recently. And I mean, it's not totally biblically accurate, but it's just very well done.
Did you watch it on YouTube or is it on Amazon or something? How can people watch it? You have to Google it?
I think it was on the Peacock app.
No way. Okay.
Yeah, it was on somewhere streaming for free. Okay. But I actually usually rent it every year. I probably should just buy it by now to watch with my kids right around Passover. So Yahweh wants to use Moses to deliver the nation of Israel out from under the yoke of slavery to Egypt after 400 years in captivity there. And he's performed great miracles in the plagues, but the Pharaoh's heart was hard and he wouldn't let the people go. So at this part that I just read, we're at the 10th and the final plague, which is death of the firstborn child from every household. And Yahweh is not only giving Moses this instruction to command every person to do these things to be spared and passed over by the angel of death, but he's also commanding this to be kept by the Israelites every year on this very specific date as a memorial of his deliverance. And very specifically, he wants us to teach it to our children, as he says in a few verses after what I just read. And when your children say to you, what does this rite mean to you? You shall say, it is a Passover sacrifice to the Lord, who passed over the houses of the sons of Israel in Egypt when he smote the Egyptians, but he spared our homes. So he gives us not only what he was going to do, but that he wanted this memorialized. And why he wanted it memorialized is he never wanted his children, the children of Israel, to forget. And he wanted them to continue to teach this to their children by this, I guess this is where the word Seder comes from, this order, this doing this exact same thing like they did it the first time. The way that I kind of think of it in my mind is acting out a play. You know, you rehearse. And it's almost like doing it in reverse. Like the real deal happened first. And then he wanted the people to continually rehearse it every year so that they would never forget what he did for them.
Sure. And I think that people that celebrate traditional holidays can understand and get this because they have built traditions that, you know, they'll hear your great grandpa or whatever did this. Right. And so then the next generation did this and the next generation did this. We can relate to it from that perspective. The difference here is that this is Yahweh saying, yeah, hey man, here it is. Here's my order. And here's how I want you to keep it.
Yeah. Yeah. So we can, that's actually a really good comparison, because I have, as I've gotten more and more into observing the feasts, have gotten further and further away from all of the worldly holidays
that are made up by someone's great grandpa.
Right. and a big reason for that is I feel like I have traditions that I'm passing on to my children that are coming right from God's word. And that's how we want to do it as a family. But I also feel like my life is plenty filled up doing these. Like I don't have time to do but like, especially like this is the first one of the year in the spring. This is my favorite. I love going all out for this one for my kids, making it really special for them. And
I
then
love that you say going all out. I can't wait to hear what that means.
Yeah. And they love it. And we have a great time. And then we have 6 more we go through. And they're not all like very detailed and a huge shebang or whatever. But by the time I get to the end of the year, I can tell you the last thing I want to do is a holiday outside of these 7.
You're like, I ain't got time for that.
No,
I've been
I'm
celebrating all year long, all of the Lord's feasts.
And I really do. And this is kind of just a side note tangent. I really believe that Yahweh did this with intention, that when he was taking his people out of Egypt, he knew that Egypt was staying in them. They were there for 400 years.
Yeah, it's a long time.
They definitely took some influence from the pagan Egyptians that they were living around. We actually see that at the base of Mount Sinai with the golden calf. They got that idea from the Egyptians. Every pagan nation had their holy days. They all did. They had their days where they worshiped their false gods. So Yahweh is saying, these are going to be my days. You can honor me by keeping these. And I think that hasn't changed. Like, yes, we cannot keep these exactly as described, but we can do our best.
So, question for you. I know people lived crazy long back then, like hundreds of years. How old was Moses? Do you know?
So actually, by the time that Moses was alive, the lifespan was down to what Yahweh had set it at after the flood, which is about 120 years.
Because my question, I guess, or my thought was, I wonder if anyone lived in slavery the whole 400 years, but it sounds like the lifespan had reduced by that time.
Yes.
So it was just multiple generations in slavery.
Yes, exactly. It was multiple generations. They were not living that long anymore. And I actually just quickly Googled it, which is very interesting because this says the Torah states that Moses died at the age of 120, which is exactly.
Well,
and I know
looks like your memory is good again.
Sharp as
trusting it.
But what I was remembering, because I just read it in Genesis 3 or 4 a few days ago, that after the flood, it says that Yahweh made the number of man's years 120. And
he's like, I'm sick of y'all. You guys live way too long. You're getting into way too much trouble. Just shorten that up.
And you can see it diminish. And while Noah still lived over 600 years. Yeah. But by the time it got to Abraham, like Abraham lived well over 100. But Abraham was, I think, at least 1,500 years before Moses, like quite a bit.
You know, it's crazy to think about this age thing. I think about people today, and when you get to about 80, most people are like, they're not pressing the gas at 80. You know, they're not inventing things when they're 80 years old. So it must have been wild to live for 300, 400 years, because that means that, you know, if you lived for 400 years, then 350 years was like 80. So think about how much you could have gotten done in 200 years or 300 years.
I know, absolutely. And I imagine that their body was decaying slower. So an 80-year-old was maybe like a 40-year-old today.
Sure.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, if you actually think about in the context of what we're discussing right now, Moses would have been about 80, I believe, when this first Passover was happening, because then they went into the wilderness where they would spend 40 years. And he was one of the last to pass away before going into the land. So, which would have been at 120. So yeah, that would put him.
If you're watching a biblical cartoon, they were either 30 years old or old man. Or child. There's only literally like 3 cartoon characters of the Bible. So he was the old man one.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So talk to us a little bit about the significance for the Christian faith.
Yeah. So from what I read a few minutes ago about the first Passover, so we're going to connect that to Yeshua's last Passover, because that's where it connects us in the Christian faith. So the firstborn of every household that was covered by the blood of the lamb is saved from the angel of death. And this brings us to why this memorial is so significant to the Christian faith and how Yeshua fulfilled this feast. So the final week before Yeshua went to the cross, he knew that he would be sacrificed on Passover, because that is what Yahweh had planned from the very beginning, like literally the beginning of time. It was all along the deeper meaning behind this original Passover in Egypt. So once again, Yahweh would deliver his people from the yoke of slavery, but this time it'd be from slavery to sin.
Even
and this
bigger.
is exactly why the gospel writers refer to Yeshua as the Lamb of God. In 1 John 1:29, John the Baptist says, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world," when he sees Yeshua approaching at the Jordan River before he was baptized and began his ministry. Or when John, the other John, the disciple John, in the book of Revelation, chapter 5, he says, "Then I saw a lamb looking as if it had been slain, standing at the center of the throne."
I'm only smiling because I did a Revelation study in the Bible app. And when you read that, I just imagined the man who does the reading of that. Then I saw a lamb looking as if it had been slain, standing at the center of the throne. He just has this very specific way of speaking, and
Proper.
Honestly, the way that he read it almost made Revelation like that much scarier than it already was, because it was like terrifying. Sorry for the aside.
But yeah, so he's referred to in the Gospels and by the gospel writers as the Lamb of God. And this is why they not only did they keep these feasts because they were all Jewish men, but they understood the deeper meaning.
Sure.
And I don't
perfect
think it
lamb was, and
right.
saving them from slavery, like you said, but this time our slavery to sin.
Yes. Yeah. And I don't think that they necessarily got it all as it was happening, but they, at least after his resurrection, like it all became clear to them. So we read in Luke chapter 22 that Yeshua sent Peter and John to go and prepare the Passover meal for him and his disciples to have together for his, quote, Last Supper, as the church likes to call it. But what the Bible calls it is the Passover meal. That's what it says in Luke.
Sure. So we gave it its own name, but it's Passover.
Right. Yeah.
And by we, I just mean people,
the church. Yeah.
Church that say Last Supper.
Yes. So all of the Gospels describe this meal, but I highly recommend anyone listening go and read all of John chapters 12 through 17. I'm not going to sit here and read all of that to you today, but it doesn't necessarily give us the semantics of how they kept this Passover. But reading those chapters, keeping in mind that everything he is saying to his disciples in that moment was over the Passover meal, it adds a layer of significance to both his words and the Passover. So it's like just think of that in your mind as you read them. I know when I did, it's like, wow, because there's some really big things that the church has always loved to quote from him in those chapters, and just picture that he said all of those things over a Passover Seder. And it's just really profound.
So does it say, because obviously you're not going to read that, but I'm curious about the lamb part. That's what I can't stop thinking about the lamb, because I don't eat lamb. But is is that like still the thing?
Well, yes, because a lamb was part of when he, in the part that I did quote from Luke of him telling John and Peter to go prepare the Passover meal. So part of what they would have had to prepare is securing
a lamb.
And in those chapters that I just referenced from John, it mentions him dipping the meat. You know, when he says that whoever I dip my hand in the bowl with at the same time is who will betray me, and it's Judas.
And it was the meat he was dipping.
And it was so it was the lamb.
Do you think it was honey mustard?
It was actually probably the bitter herbs, because it's part of the command for Passover. Yeah. So now we get to one of the most significant parts of the Passover meal, and that even more so than the lamb. I know you're really hung up on the lamb.
I'm hung up on the lamb. Do you eat lamb?
I do at Passover, and I can tell you I don't like it that much.
I just never, ever had lamb in my whole life. It wasn't something that we ever ate at home as children. And I mentally have this thing about lambs. They're just cute lambs. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I am very curious about the lamb part. What does it taste like?
To me, I have not had it very many times, but most of the time
only on Passover.
Yes. And like one time before all of this. And most of the time it tastes kind of gamey, like venison a little bit.
Okay.
But one time, my friend who we have been celebrating Passover with every year this will be our third year. When she prepared it was actually really good, and I liked it. I do kind of have a little bit of because we didn't grow up eating it, like, all right, I'll have some chicken now. But I tried to just eat at least a little bit and
dip it in the bitter herbs, have a bite.
Yeah, exactly. If it's one bite, then that's it.
Is it dark meat, or is it dark like a steak, or is it light?
It's dark like venison.
Okay. I mean, I guess that would make sense, because chicken is a bird and a lamb is closer to like a small goat or
which we definitely haven't had goat before. But if you don't have access to a goat, or a lamb,
you would have a goat.
According to what I read, you could also eat goat. But this is very common in other countries, eating, especially goat.
Yeah. Both of them are very common in other cultures. We grew up in the McDonald's culture, and
we don't want our meat to resemble little baby animals.
Yeah, I know. It's a mental thing, right?
Yeah.
So tell us about the bread, because that is as significant or more so.
So what I'm going to focus on a little bit more is the bread and the cups of wine. So what is actually commanded to be part of the Passover meal is eating the meal with unleavened bread, because it was with haste that the Israelites would have to flee Egypt once the angel of death passed over. So there would be no time for the bread to rise. So that's the whole thing.
So it's more of a significance thing than anything. It's significant of the fact that they had to get out of there. They didn't have time for their bread to finish.
Exactly. So in Deuteronomy 16, Yahweh specifies more about what is the second feast of the year, which literally begins at the Passover meal, which is to take place at sundown. And most feasts in the Bible, or not most, all of the feasts in the Bible begin at sundown, because that is what is considered the beginning of a day. What is kind of a misconception a little bit about Passover is that it's not actually a day, it's actually a meal. So the Passover meal takes place
I see.
And we might think of that as like Passover day because we're preparing for it and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
But at sundown, which is when the meal is to be eaten, is when what begins the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And the command is to remove all leaven, which is yeast, from the home and to only eat bread made without leaven for 7 days. Unleavened bread is called the bread of affliction, so that you may remember the days when you came out of Egypt.
It does sound like an affliction to eat bread without yeast in it. I'm just kidding.
Yeah. The first and the last day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread are to be Sabbaths, which means no work should be done on those days.
Mm-hmm.
So without understanding this feast, we may miss why there was such a rush to bury Yeshua on the day of his crucifixion, on the day of Passover, because at sundown, this Sabbath of unleavened bread would begin, and they would not be permitted to bury anyone for the entire day after.
Oh, I see. So it starts at sundown and then you're on a Sabbath, so you're not supposed to work. So,
yes.
okay.
So that's why they were rushing to get him into the tomb.
Okay.
So here's where some traditional elements of Passover pick up. And while these are not part of the commands from these passages that I referenced in the Torah, they were a part of a traditional Passover Seder by Yeshua's time, because it's obvious he was observing them in his Seder. I think this is important to note because while Passover can be kept very simply, exactly according to the scripture, it doesn't mean there's anything wrong with including some of these traditions, since the Messiah did, and he was Jewish after all. So part of the Seder tradition is blessing over the wine and blessings over this unleavened bread, which that part was commanded to be a part of the meal. So I guess what I'm saying is the wine is not in that original command for Passover, but it is a tradition that formed, and it was part of Yeshua's Passover that we're reading about in the Gospels. So traditionally, there are what's called the 4 cups of the Passover Seder. These are called the cup of sanctification, which remembers, I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. Then there's the cup of plagues, which remembers, I will deliver you from their bondage. Then there's the cup of redemption, which remembers, I will also redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgment. And the last and 4th cup is the cup of praise, which remembers, I will take you for my people. And what's really cool, and the whole reason I'm referencing these traditions, is it's believed that when Yeshua said, this cup which is poured out for you is the new covenant of my blood, he was referring to the 3rd cup at the Seder, which is the cup of redemption. So how beautiful is that? That if he was keeping these traditions of having these 4 cups, and they kind of go back to back throughout the meal, that when he was taking the 3rd cup, which every Jew there, because they all were, would have known as the cup of redemption, that's when he spoke those words, because he was going to redeem his people.
It's beautiful, but it's kind of sad.
Yeah, it is.
Because he knew what was coming next, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So after the 1st cup, blessing traditionally is the removal of what's called the afikomen, which is a bag that contains exactly 3 slices of matzah, which is unleavened bread. This bag of matzah is also called the echad, or unity. The Jews have different meanings for this, but I can't help but notice how this perfectly symbolizes the Trinity, especially the echadness of the Trinity, since that's the best word I can think of to sum up the Godhead, is unity. So at this point in the Seder, the head of the meal, so in Yeshua's final Passover, or in this final Passover, it would be Yeshua. He was the head of the Seder. would remove the middle piece of matzah, break it in half, and wrap it in a linen cloth and hide it somewhere in the house. And this piece is what's called the afikomen, which means that which comes after. And at this point in the meal, we can see Yeshua breaking the bread, saying, and when he had taken some bread and given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, this is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. So do you see how every element of even the traditions of this meal represent Yeshua?
Mm-hmm.
And he was doing, like, acting this all out for them. And I just imagine how it was hitting them in that moment. Like, just look at a piece of matzah. Like, if you've never held one or seen one in person, Google what matzah looks like. It is such a perfect picture of his body. It's pierced through with holes and striped by the baking process. The look of matzah gives an illusion of the Messiah's suffering that's prophesied in Isaiah 53:5. For he was pierced through for our transgressions, and with his stripes we are healed. The Bible, both Old and New Testament, also uses leaven to represent sin. And matzah is the bread without any leaven or sin as part of the command for keeping this feast. So for him to say, this is my body, it is the perfect symbol for that.
Yeah, so much symbolism there.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are so many other elements of the traditions of Passover that I could go on and on and on about this for hours. But to not make this episode 3 hours and try to get us in under an hour, I will just say that I highly recommend getting I actually have the book right next to me. It's called Messiah in the Feast of Israel by Sam Nadler, for even more details of each component of the meal, like the bitter herbs and the rest of the order of it.
I'll link it in the show notes.
Yes. Yeah. That would be great. Yeah. I highly recommend this book. If you do get it after listening to this episode, you'll recognize some of the things I said, because I definitely referenced this book a lot while taking my notes. I just wanted to focus, though, on the most significant ones we can see in the bread and the wine and the lamb. Because to me, what I'm trying to paint a picture for everyone is why this is significant as a Christian. But one other thing I will say is, as I mentioned, every one of these spring feasts was fulfilled by Yeshua during this time. So the second feast, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which began at sundown during the Passover, was fulfilled after his crucifixion. Much like the afikomen, that piece of unleavened bread that was wrapped in clean linen and hidden away, Yeshua's pierced and striped body was wrapped in clean linen and hidden away in a tomb for 3 days. So he was in the tomb during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. But as we know, he would rise from the dead, and 3 days after his death on Passover, on a very specific day, which would fulfill the third feast in the year. And that one we will get into next week.
Wow.
So I hope that brought clarity to how those two first feasts were fulfilled.
Yeah, sure. It definitely did. And spawned some questions too, which I think the first thing that a lot of Christians are probably going to think is, well, why don't Christians keep Passover then?
Yes. So why we don't is pretty complex. It began in the first few centuries after his death, burial, and resurrection. There was, a lot of Gentiles converting, and originally they were keeping the feasts. And we can see this in the New Testament. Paul references it many times, and he is encouraging new Gentile believers to keep the feasts. Some of these verses are highly taken out of context. But what happened after those first apostles were dying out is not only was there strong anti-Semitism in the early church and a lot of the church fathers, that they wanted to be separate from the Jews who were not accepting the Messiah. But then also the Jews who were not accepting the Messiah, they wanted to be separate from the Jews and Gentiles that were accepting the Messiah. So there was just this kind of separation between people. But then what continued to happen over the following centuries is just this, especially once Constantine came into the picture, that everything was going to be separate from Jews. And it actually, many laws were passed that if anyone was caught keeping the Sabbath, or specifically the Passover, that they would be killed. So there was this strong push to prevent anyone, believers and Jews, from keeping the Passover.
I see.
So I believe that that is the biggest reason. And I think a lot of times people don't necessarily understand our church history and how rampant and anti-Semitism was in our church history. Like, one of the biggest anti-Semites in history is Martin Luther, who was like head of the Reformation, which split the Catholic Church from the, what is now the Protestant church. And a lot of people revere him as this amazing man. But we have his writings where he's literally calling people to burn down synagogues and murder Jews. He hated Jews. So that is a lot of this undertone in the Christian faith that didn't exist in the first century. The first century, they were all doing this. It's just gotten so far away, and so much really negative and hateful things that tainted it. So while we're really far away from that, and I don't believe that most people in the church are anti-Semitic, it's like that's part of what the history of the church is based on.
Sure. So it sounds to me like what you're saying is there was a concerted effort to not allow people to follow the biblical feasts, Sabbath, Passover, etc., because some folks didn't like that, i.e., they were probably being influenced by the enemy, because if these are God's holidays and God's commands, then to force someone not to be able to follow those things is pretty heavy. Sounds like some enemy work to me.
Absolutely.
But it became so rampant, and then paganism and the Roman Catholic Church and so many other influences brought in all these other holidays and traditions, which we will address in the summer.
Yeah.
That we today are just so far from this that we don't even understand it, that we're just like, oh, those are just Jewish holidays. Yeah. But the truth is, if these other things hadn't happened, then likely we would be following these holidays.
Absolutely. I really believe that. And I honestly,
well, I guess a lot of people are now.
Well, that's what I was
now that we're learning and we live in a freer society.
Yes. And that's what I was actually about to say, is I honestly truly believe that the Father is calling people back to this. There's actually, I wish I had it in my notes, but I didn't think of it till we were talking about it just now. But there's a verse in one of the books of the prophets about, it might be a psalm actually, but it's about finding the ancient path and following the ancient paths of Yahweh. And there's so much prophecy, as in many of the books of prophecy, about the end times, and that people who were never a part of God's ways would be coming in. And I think that as we're getting closer and closer, we're seeing that more and more. And, in our episode from a few weeks ago, when I just talked about how I rediscovered these things, I could not attribute any of it to anything other than the Holy Spirit. It just felt like him just drawing me in and drawing me in. And it's one of the reasons that Passover will always be really special to me, is he really used this day to open my eyes in a lot of ways. And it totally changed my whole perspective. So I'm more educated now than I was back then. But all it took was that just little seed, and he grew it.
That's awesome. So I have a final quick question for you as we're closing out. How can Passover be kept today by those listening?
So to keep it simple and not to give people a bunch of homework, but I mentioned this book in that other episode. It's called A Christian Guide to the Biblical Feast by David Wilbur. I highly recommend that book because it's very short. It's shorter than the other one that we'll have in the show notes by Sam Nadler.
Well, both of them will be in the show notes.
Yeah. But really, though, to just keep it simple, a Christian today can keep Passover. You can do it with your family. I think it's very special to do it with other believers, and just do what it says in Exodus or Deuteronomy. You just have lamb, bitter herbs, unleavened bread, and you can do the traditional element of the wine. And one thing that I will say that last year when we kept Passover is there's one of the traditions in a Passover Seder is like a ceremonial washing of the hands. I didn't have any connection to that because I didn't really read it in the Torah as a part of the command. But what I did see is on Yeshua's final Passover, he, instead of doing that, was washing his disciples' feet. And so,
no, I'm just kidding.
But it's it has its own symbolism.
I thought they were supposed to keep their sandals on, man.
Well, they had really dirty feet because they wore sandals all the time.
So clean your feet and then put your sandals on.
Yeah. So last year we decided to just take a minute of everyone that we invited to our Passover Seder to just have a minute of, as the hosts, of washing everyone's feet. And the moment that it really hit me was when my husband was washing my feet. Aww. And we weren't doing like, pedicure scrubbing here. It was just a dip in a bowl and a wipe off with a cloth. It was a ceremonial thing, but it was just really special to be doing something that our Messiah, our teacher did as his disciples. So you can definitely look up a Christian. It's called a Haggadah, which is the order of events, and, kind of figure out how to do a Passover meal and keep it in an order. Or you could just keep it really simple. Read the Gospels, read what his looked like, read Deuteronomy about the parts about Passover, and just keep it really simple. And I promise you, you will be blessed from it. I every year feel blessed after the Passover.
I love it. Awesome. Thank you for sharing all about Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread with us.
Thank you for listening.
Yeah, we're going to be continuing to talk about the feasts, the other feasts. So if you just want to keep learning, stay tuned because you're going to hear about it. And I'm very excited for the rest because this is very new to me too. Rachel has shared a lot of this with me, but not even to this extent. So a lot of what I'm learning for the first time too. So that's why all my questions are really dumb. But thank you all for tuning in and for being on this journey with us. If you'd like to follow along, you can join us on Instagram or on Facebook at The Radiant Mission, or also on YouTube. And today we're going to be closing with 1 Corinthians 5, verses 6 through 8. Your boasting is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump of dough? Clean out the old leaven so that you may be a new lump, just as you are, in fact, unleavened. For Christ, our Passover, also has been sacrificed. Therefore, let us celebrate the feast, not with old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Wishing you a radiant week, and we will see you next time.
Bye, guys.
Bye.